Hello, my name is Carlos Pereira de Cruz, and this is the podcast 15 Minutes of Pharma. So, welcome. Today's episode is about how the pharmaceutical value chain was rebuilt and why CDMOs and private equity played such a decisive role in that transformation. Our guest is someone who has lived this industry from the inside, from fermentation tanks to factory floors, from FDA audits to complex turnaround projects. Manuel Fernandes is an API specialist, former industrial director and consultant with decades of hands-on experience. And today we start with this question. Manuel, when you think back to the way pharma used to be organized, what did everyone assume was just the way the things had to be?
Mm-hmm. Well, Carlos, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here for episode 3 of our 15 Minutes of Pharma. And answering your question, I would say that, for much of the 20th century, the pharmaceutical industry was built on the assumption that innovation, development, and manufacturing should live inside the same organization. And that made sense in a world that was relatively predictable. Product life cycles were relatively long, pipelines were narrower, regulatory frameworks were relatively stable, and capital intensity, while significant, was manageable within large integrated companies. So, owning manufacturing assets was seen as a source of control and security. Execution methods, of course, but it wasn't really viewed as a strategic differentiator. It was something you internalized mainly to protect the core. And that model worked until the industry changed faster than the model could adapt.
And at what point did that model start to feel like a constraint rather than something like a strength? Not in theory, but in day-to-day operations?
Well, Carlos, I would say that, several pressures started to converge. Pipelines became more complex and less predictable. Time to market became critical. Regulatory requirements intensified, and capital expenditure increased, not just in size, but in technological specificity. And at the same time, pricing pressure increased across most therapeutic areas. So suddenly, vertical integration stopped being a source of strength, and it became a source of rigidity. So, Carlos, manufacturing assets turned into somehow fixed cost burdens, and capacity planning became risky. And the opportunity cost of capital locked into plants increased dramatically. And that's when fragmentation of the value chain stopped being accidental and became really deliberate.
Deliberate. So that's an important distinction. So people often talk about outsourcing as a cost story, but from what you've seen, what was the real reason these CDMOs took off?
Yeah, exactly, Carlos. And this is often misunderstood. The rise of CDMOs, in my view, was not primarily about making things cheaper. It was really about, executing better through specialization. What pharma companies started doing was a deliberate deconstruction of their own value chain. And they started asking a fundamental question, which was, which activities truly create strategic differentiation? And which activities benefit from scale, from repetition, and focused operational excellence. For instance, manufacturing, formulation, development, scale up, all these activities reward specialization. And Carlos, I would argue that this is the real origin of the CDMO model. Specialization at scale, not simple outsourcing.
Okay, and how did this deconstruction change the economics of manufacturing?
Carlos, I think we can say that it really changed everything. Manufacturing moved from a vertical integrated fixed asset model to a modular capability. Um, the make or buy decision became a first order strategic choice, not a tactical one. So by externalizing execution to specialized partners, pharma companies reduced, capital intensity, they increased flexibility, they shared technological and regulatory risk, and they accelerated time to market. And at the same time, CDMOs could invest deeply in specific technologies, processes, and quality systems because execution was their core business. So um, execution stopped being a back office function and it really became a competitive advantage.
Yeah. So can you give a concrete example where execution and the CDMO model were decisive, not just operationally, but strategically?
Sure, Carlos, and gladly I would refer what I think is a very illustrative example, which is Paratek Pharmaceuticals and the development of omadacycline. This was one of the flagship CDMO projects we brought to and managed at CIPA. So Paratek was a biotech company operating in one of the most challenging therapeutic areas, antibiotics. Scientifically, Carlos, omadacycline was a real solid asset. However, commercially and industrially, the bar was extremely high. Paratek did not have the scale, the capital base, or internal manufacturing infrastructure to really industrialize and supply such a product alone. So for them, the execution risk was really existential. And so, in that context, manufacturing, formulation, scale up, and regulatory readiness were not downstream concerns. They were really value defining decisions. So the ability to rely on specialized external partners, meaning CDMOs with deep CMC expertise and regulatory credibility, was really critical to bringing omadacycline to the market. And Carlos, I think this is a good example of how the CDMO model, it's not just about outsourcing capacity. It really is about embedding execution capability into the sponsor's business model. Without that execution backbone, the science alone would not have been enough.
Yeah. So in cases like this, execution effectively becomes part of the value proposition. Yeah.
Exactly, Carlos. In these models, execution is no longer downstream of strategy. It is strategy. The CDMO becomes a structural component of how risk is managed, how capital is allocated, and most important, how value is really realized. This is precisely why the CDMO model scaled so effectively, and especially in biotech-driven innovation.
And this is where private equity enters the picture, right?
Yes, Carlos, absolutely. But it is important to be precise about the role private equity actually played. Obviously, private equity didn't invent the CDMO model, but they recognized something fundamental early on, which was that fragmentation was the bottleneck in the industry. Carlos, across Europe and globally, the CDMO landscape was and still is highly fragmented. There are many companies, founder-led, undercapitalized, subscale, or even constrained by succession issues. And private equity saw an industrial opportunity, not just a financial one. Consolidation, when done well, wasn't really about financial engineering. It was really about building scale where scale mattered, professionalizing governance, accelerating capex, and well, upgrading facilities. So, Carlos, in many cases, private equity acted really as an industrial aggregator.
So consolidation was a prerequisite for the model to really work.
Absolutely, Carlos. Well, once CDMOs reached a certain scale, they really could invest in things that smaller players simply couldn't afford, meaning advanced technologies, regulatory systems, digital infrastructure, global customer coverage, and well, deep quality culture. And well, all these shifted the relationship with pharma sponsors. Um, you know, CDMOs stopped being interchangeable suppliers and became really strategic partners. And well, CDMOs were often and are often involved earlier in development decisions and in influencing critical decisions around formulation, process, and scale up. So, well, we can say that the value chain didn't just fragment. It it really reorganized itself around execution excellence.
Execution excellence. So, from the sponsor's perspective, what changed in how they select and work with the CDMOs?
Yeah, that's really a interesting and important question, Carlos. We would say, I would argue that sponsors become far more selective. They no longer looked for capacity alone. They started looking for reliability under pressure, regulatory credibility, and well, the ability to execute complex programs repeatedly. So this meant that switching costs increased and relationships between sponsors and CDMOs became long term, and well, trust became a strategic asset. So in many cases, Carlos, CDMOs really became an extension of the sponsor's own organization, not in ownership, but in operational criticality.
Okay, yeah. So all of this seems to have worked remarkably well. Was the model perfectly adapted to its environment?
Well, I would argue that it was uh, for the environment in which it emerged. The CDMO and private equity model was built in a world where globalization was assumed, well, where trade flows were stable, where regulatory systems were broadly aligned, and well, and where efficiency was prioritized over resilience. And so, in that context, the model delivered exactly what the industry needed, meaning scale, flexibility, and execution power. And well, Carlos, my view, that's why it scaled so successfully over the last 2 decades.
Yeah, 2 decades. It's a lot of time. Yeah, and that brings us to the transition point. So, what question does this raise now?
Well, the key question, Carlos, is no longer whether CDMOs and private equity reshaped pharmaceutical manufacturing. No doubt, they clearly did. The question, Carlos, is whether this model, as it stands, is sufficient for the environment we are now entering. And this is an environment defined by geopolitical tension, regulatory asymmetry, increased scrutiny of supply chains, and well, strategic competition between regions. And well, this episode has deliberately focused on how the current model was built and why it made sense. Uh, because we talk about fragility or anti-fragility, fair play or systemic risk, we need to be clear about the foundations we're standing on. So, well, the CDMO and private equity model gave the industry scale, flexibility, and execution power. Whether it also delivers system-level resilience, well, Carlos, that's the conversation we need to have next.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, Manuel, for this conversation. So this episode was about understanding how the current model was built and why it made sense. In the next conversation, we'll ask whether it also gives us resilience in a changing world. That's all for today's episode of 15 Minutes of Pharma. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Carlos.